Well, it's quite a pivotal moment right now for Ukraine coming off the Trump-Putin meeting Friday in Alaska. Ukraine's president, of course, at the White House on Monday for a meeting with President Trump and European leaders. Somebody who's watching it all and watching it all from abroad in Ukraine is journalist Adam Zivo. He's columnist with the National Post. You can read his latest on all of this at nationalpost.com. Adam, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on the show.
What is the mood right now in Ukraine? I saw one poll out on Monday suggesting maybe Ukrainians are more willing to try to find a way to end this war. Or maybe there's some fatigue with all of this, but of course some nervousness too at what this could all potentially mean right now.
There has been polling data showing for quite some time that the majority of Ukrainians are in favor of a negotiated settlement of this war. At the same time, the devil is in the details here. When you break down this data, you find that there are high levels of support for ending the war without making considerable land concessions. But when you specify that a peace agreement would involve, for example, giving away Crimea or giving up Luhansk and Donetsk or giving away Zaporizhia and Kherson, support for a peace negotiation really goes down. And there's a bit of an issue here because pro Kremlin sycophants and propagandists will often use this polling data and present it without context to give the impression that Ukrainians just want to give up and want to have a peace deal right away by any means necessary. And then they use that to frame the Zelensky government as not representing the will of the people, even though Zelensky's approval ratings are around 65 to 70%.
You know, there's this almost like perverse strategy by Putin, it seems, where he has stepped up the bombing and the missile and the drone attacks on Ukrainian civilian populations in recent months, maybe with the hope then of fueling that kind of perception that people just want this to end, and then using that to actually get more concessions in all of this.
Yeah, he's trying to break the will of the Ukrainian people, and a lot of this boils down to the developments of war technology during this conflict. So at the very beginning, drones were not a significant thing. The war that we're fighting right now is very different from the war from 3 years ago. Drones have become essential to warfare, and to give an anecdote that illustrates this, back in late 2022, I went to the Kharkiv area to follow some Canadian volunteers. And we went near the front lines. We even had two fighter jets pass over our heads. And I spoke with one of those volunteers last month, and he said that that could never happen now. Because if you're within 100 or 50 kilometers of the front lines, you have to be very careful because a drone can hunt you and kill you. Now, at the very beginning, late 2022, the Iranians provided the most important drone technology to the Russians, which would be these large-scale kamikaze drones, as opposed to, for example, smaller scale FPV drones that are more commercially available. Now, in late 2022 or early 2023, Iran was essential here. These drones were still being developed. They were kind of slow. And then Russia took this Iranian technology and perfected it. So they made these drones faster, more maneuverable. Now they can fly higher, they can fly lower. And then they onshored production. So by early 2024, I think they were producing around, I don't know, like 500 drones a month. But by early 2025, those numbers began to rapidly increase. So they actually increased their drone production on a monthly level by tenfold or so. And from my understanding, earlier this summer, they were producing about 2,500 large kamikaze drones per month, plus an additional 2,500 decoy drones. So the idea here is that they launch large swarms of drones, 300 or 400 at a time, sometimes 500. And this was completely unheard of, a year and a half ago, 100 drones. That was a story. Now that's just a Friday. And they are hoping to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. Because if you have a drone like this, cost maybe $20,000, you're not going to intercept that with an anti-air missile, which is going to cost about $1 million. So normally you have to shoot them down with like machine guns, but then people get tired, right? And then following that, after the air defenses have been exhausted, then they launch things like ballistic missiles, right, which are much more lethal and much more difficult to intercept. And so civilian casualties have increased significantly over the past few months, coinciding with Trump's administration. Trump said he was going to end the killing. The killing has only gotten significantly worse under his watch, yet Ukrainians remain resilient. throughout Odessa, which is where I spend most of my time. I haven't seen any appetite to give up. People are fatigued. 3 years
Mhm.
of war will do that to anyone, but they also understand the stakes involved. For example, in Odessa, we are 4 hours west of the front lines. So if you go just along the Black Sea coast, you get to Kherson eventually. That is a provincial capital. It was the only provincial capital that fell in 2022. It was then liberated 6 or 7 months into the war, and it sits on a river. And on the other side of the river, you have the Russians, and they send in drones, small little FPV drones, and they hunt civilians and they kill them every single day. And I've interviewed people who were under occupation from Kherson, and they talked about the arbitrary arrests and murders that happened there. And any journalist who you'll meet who works in Ukraine, I mean, if they're good at their job, uh, because sometimes we do have grifters come through here, they will have interviewed people who have been under occupation, and universally the stories are horrifying. And Ukrainians are aware of that. They're not blind or deaf. They have families, members. Many of them have family members who are living under occupation. So no one wants to accept a full Russian occupation of the country because they know how awful that would be.
Right, and right now it seems like it's on the table, the idea of freezing everything in place so that these occupations and these circumstances that people are enduring, that would be locked in.
It would be, but what Putin's demanding is more than that. So
Yeah.
let's go into the details of Putin's peace demands. And they've been quite consistent over the past 3 years. So back in early 2022, in March and April, you had the first round of Istanbul peace talks. And what the Russian negotiators demanded was that Ukraine give up all of its international alliances, severely reduce the size of its military, severely reduce the size of its weapons arsenals, uh, and basically like demilitarize itself, cede Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. And in exchange, Russia would put together a consortium of security guarantors to ensure that Ukraine is not invaded again. But the caveat of this system is that Russia wanted to create this system in a way where each guarantor had veto power over any military intervention from the other guarantors. Russia also wanted to be one of these guarantors. So essentially, they would create a system, a security system, where Russia would be able to veto any allies' defense of Ukraine. So it's a scam, right? Ukraine said no. Now, in the spring, when you had the second round of Istanbul negotiations, basically the same thing. Russia saying, we want you to cede these four territories, and we're not really going to give anything in return. We're going to promise that we're not going to invade you. Now, the important thing to remember here is that these four provinces, they're where the front lines primarily are. And consequently, that's where most of Ukraine's defensive fortifications are. So for Ukraine to hand over these territories, they would have to very abruptly abandon the vast majority of their defensive fortifications. And then they would have to rebuild them in neighboring oblasts, regions, where the territory is much less amenable to defense, and that takes time and a lot of money. And basically, they would just leave, they would give up their shield, and for the promise that Russia wouldn't invade again, even though Russia has broken every single promise about invasion in the past before. Now, in the Alaska summit, what Putin did is that he narrowed his demands, and instead of demanding all four provinces, he demanded only Donetsk. Now, for Luhansk, it doesn't really matter because Russia already controls 99% of Luhansk, whereas he controls about 70% of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. So he said, okay, you give us Donetsk, and we will freeze the front lines in Kherson and Zaporizhia. Now, the thing is that Russia has not made any gains in quite some time in Zaporizhia or Kherson. So that concession, in quotation marks, is of very little value to the Ukrainians. But by giving up Donetsk, the Ukrainians would give up this belt of fortress cities, for example, Kramatorsk. These are several cities and small towns that exist in a cluster in the center of Donetsk, and they had been fortified over the course of 11 years because this invasion began in 2014. And it is the core of Ukraine's defense against the Eastern invasion. So if they give all of that up, they're giving up. They would have to give up their most important shield, once again in exchange for a written promise that Russia wouldn't invade. Steve Witkoff, who's the special envoy for the Trump administration in this case, He said, and this is ridiculous, this is the stupidest thing I have ever heard. He said that Russia will change its constitution, and its new constitution will say that they just won't invade. And look, I'm going to use some language that's not very PC, but like this is retarded, right? Um, this is a dictatorship. Constitutional changes are not are not a big problem. You can
No.
just change a constitution like this in Russia if you need to. The constitution guarantees, for example, free and fair elections. That doesn't exist in Russia. It guarantees freedom of speech. That doesn't exist either. It's a piece of toilet paper there. So why would the Americans think that this security guarantee would matter at all? So you can see here why the Ukrainians are very concerned about what was seemingly, discussed in the Alaska summit, and why today, as everyone is coming to Washington, they brought all of their allies. You brought the leaders of Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, France, Finland, because the Finnish president apparently has a very good relationship with Trump. So they brought them all here to ensure that Trump doesn't impose this terrible peace deal, peace in quotation marks. It's more of a surrender upon Ukraine, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it was, you're looking back to Friday, and I mean, we'd heard all this talk that, Trump is becoming impatient and he's really frustrated with Vladimir Putin. He said there's going to be a ceasefire, or if there's no ceasefire, there's going to be some consequences. And then it just seemed like he kind of got rolled on Friday. There was no ceasefire, there are no consequences. And he just seemed almost like he was giddy to see Putin. It was an odd spectacle.
Yeah, I don't know. The relationship between them sometimes reminds me of, I don't know, like an abusive romantic relationship where Trump is like, I can fix him, right?
Yeah.
Oh, he's so good to me. He loves me. No, Putin, no, don't bomb them. Please stop. And then I think he began to realize that maybe this relationship was not as didn't have as much mutual respect as he thought. And because they hadn't spoken in a while, there was an increased sense of alienation. There was an increased sense of resentment. His rhetoric really changed last month. But then they met in person again, and Trump was beaming like a child
Right.
who was in the presence one of his favorite celebrities. So I guess that in-person meeting temporarily resets Trump's perception of Putin, which is bad news for all of us.
And I don't know if Putin would have gone for it, but wouldn't it be something to have these two meetings kind of merged into one? I mean, the idea that Ukraine's future is going to be decided when they're not at the table anyway, I think is terrible. But sure, by all means, let's have Putin, but let's have Zelensky, let's have these European leaders, let's have the president. That would have been a different story, wouldn't it?
Putin doesn't want that. So for Russia, one of their main propaganda points is that the government of Ukraine is illegitimate. So they've tried to smear the Ukrainian government as neo-Nazis for years, which is absolute crap. Like anyone who's lived here or has even visited here for a few days can tell you that it's crap. And they basically say Zelensky's not a real president. Now they're using the fact that elections have been suspended during wartime to say that Zelensky cannot negotiate on behalf of Ukraine, uh, even though this is something that there's a lot of precedent for. I mean, the United Kingdom didn't have elections during war, same with Canada to a certain extent. Uh, you can't really have an election when people can bomb your polling stations. But Russia basically says, we're not going to negotiate with you because you're not equal to us. You're not a real government. You're not a valid stakeholder. And then this is their way of humiliating Ukraine, of marginalizing Kyiv, and of pushing for regime change so they can have a more malleable, more pro-Russian government installed in Kyiv that can turn Ukraine into a Russian protectorate or vassal state.
Which is why Ukraine wants the protection of NATO, similar to what Estonia and Latvia have now. Finland, of course, and this seems like a big red line for Vladimir Putin. So, what do you make of this talk we're hearing now that NATO would be off the table, but there would be some kind of security guarantees that would be comparable, whatever that means, to Article 5?
I'll believe it when I see it. But the reason why I mentioned the consortium of security guarantors that was proposed in 2022 is that this makes me skeptical of this system that has been proposed today. Uh, because we don't know what this system will look like. Uh, Apparently, Putin proposed that China would be part of this system of guarantors, which is really weird. China is a close ally of Russia. So is the idea that Chinese troops would be stationed in Ukraine, which would be really absurd given the complicated politics here. But until we get more details, I don't feel overly optimistic here, especially with the rhetoric coming out of the White House recently. They've recently just began parroting Russian propaganda points. And so, look, if they come up with some kind of security guarantees that actually seem to work, that would be awesome. But if they don't, then that's bad. And actually, a thought just came to my head right now, which is that the great thing with Article 5 with NATO is that everyone has an interest in protecting it because they know it benefits them, right? So every member country benefits, and so they have an interest in supporting it. Whereas if you created an alternative system, a parallel system that only benefits Ukraine, um, there's really no reason for the other country. Like the other countries say, we don't want to intervene, and like this whole system has been like just falls apart. It doesn't harm them,
Yeah.
right? In the same way that they would be harmed if they hollowed out NATO. So I think the Ukrainians are justifiably skeptical here. And there's been a history of them accepting Western backed security guarantees that have been useless. The most notable one being the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which is where Ukraine, which had the third largest nuclear arsenal, which it inherited from the Soviet Union. And when I say inherited, it doesn't mean that they came from Russia. Like, like Ukraine had a lot of nuclear scientists. They built this arsenal, as part of the Soviet Union. They inherited it because they helped build it, and then they were forced to give it away by the United States and by Russia. And Russia and the United States both promised that they would protect Ukrainian sovereignty, and that didn't happen. So this could be just a repeat of that, where instead of just giving away, the hard power of their nuclear arsenal in exchange for security guarantees, they give away land and their fortress belt for security guarantees that in 3-4 years might not mean anything.
So in the meantime, Adam, I mean, if we get to a situation where Putin's not interested in real peace and Trump or the White House can at least finally, hopefully see that, is there an opportunity to change the circumstances on the ground to provide the kind of support that would at least, push the Russians back, stop these strikes, these missile and drone strikes on cities? Is there an opportunity then to help change the equation in that sense?
Well, I would say that Crimea is probably lost, and I don't see how the Ukrainians can take that back. And I think that that would create the risk of nuclear war because the Russians see Crimea as theirs in a way that they don't see the other parts of Ukraine. I think that if there were a way to create a Russian collapse, you would have to focus on economic pressure, right? So right now, the Russian economy is sputtering. They were able to avoid a collapse earlier by spending all of their reserves and basically stimulating the economy by investing a whole bunch into defense production and related industries. And so they overheated their economy in the same way that you overheat an economy whenever you have a whole bunch of stimulus spending. And now that money is beginning to run out, and they're on the cusp of a recession. So they have high inflation because of they spent all of their money, and they have really high interest rates right now. I think like 20%, 21%, something absurd like that, but I haven't checked the numbers recently. So they have both of those factors combined. Inflation is still staying up. The reserves are mostly exhausted. If you disrupt their economy by bombing their economic infrastructure, like their oil infrastructure, that would be great. Then you can maybe force them to agree to a peace deal. That would be the most realistic option. And we're getting there slowly, but unfortunately, Trump he seems not he's delaying sanctions again and again and again.
Yeah. We'll see what comes of all of this. Much more is mentioned your latest at nationalpost.com. And folks can follow you on X, on Twitter, at Zivo. Adam, always do appreciate the insight on all this. Thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Thanks for having me.